Welcome, everyone, to episode number 47 of our Virtual Masonic Education series. And I will tell you this, one of these days, I'm going to get that web guy, whoever handles all that stuff, to update those pictures and maybe a new opening song. So when you find out who that person is, let me know and we'll get on them real good. Brothers, it's great to see you again. Weather's changing. Hopefully your allergies are in check. But all things considered, in all seriousness, we're very happy to see you again. We have a great presentation for you tonight. Brother Darrin Gulla is going to be talking about a unique subject, a subject that we are all somewhat familiar with. And for those of you who are coming back to us tonight, we appreciate your continued support. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we welcome you. We hope you enjoy tonight and are willing to come back and participate with us again. For anyone watching this video online, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel so that way you never miss a monthly episode of our Virtual Masonic Education series. And at any time, if you're interested in joining with us live, you can RSVP at rubiconmasonicSociety.com/RSVP. Of course, I want to say a special thank you to Ware Lodge of Research and Lexington Lodge No. 1 and all of the brethren of the Rubicon Masonic Society. These are the men and brothers that keep this program going, and we appreciate their help and support greatly. Tonight, we're going to have two opening prayers for you. The first will come from our chaplain, Worship Brother Alan Martin, and then we'll have a follow-up prayer by Brother Darrin Gulla, our presenter tonight. So, Worship Brother Alan, will you please do the honors of the opening devotion, sir?
Brothers, let's pray. Most holy and glorious Lord God, the grand architect of the universe, the giver of all good gifts and graces, thou hast promised that where two or three are gathered together in thy name, thou wilt be in the midst of them and bless them. In thy name we assemble, most humbly beseeching thee to bless us in all our undertakings, that we may know and serve thee aright, and to advance in our knowledge and virtue. And we beseech thee, O Lord God, to bless our present assembly, and to illuminate our minds, that we may walk in the light of thy countenance, and when the trials of our probationary state are over, be admitted into the temple, not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Amen.
So might it be.
Thank you, Worship Brother. And Brother Gulla, if you wouldn't mind, please deliver a brief preamble to the nature of your prayer, and feel free to begin whenever you want.
Excellent. I thought this particular prayer would be appropriate for the topic of our conversation this evening, and it should become apparent as we go through the material. First off, this is going to be the brief prayer that we encounter at the beginning of the entered apprentice degree. So, vouchsafe thine aid, Almighty Father of the universe, to this our present convention, and grant that these candidates for Masonry may dedicate their lives to thy service and become true and faithful brethren among us. Endue them with the competency of thy divine wisdom, that by the influence of the pure principles of our art, that they may be better enabled to display the beauties of holiness to the honor of thy holy name. Amen.
So might it be.
Thank you, Brother Gulla. Gentlemen, as you know, the purpose of these virtual Masonic educations is to figure out how to make us better, to come together, devoted to our family and our faith and our country. So may we all come together tonight to learn, to subdue our passions, to discipline our minds, and improve ourselves through the tools of Freemasonry. Quick disclaimer, any opinions expressed during this education tonight will be those of the presenter or participant. They do not necessarily reflect the views of any lodge or Grand Lodge or the Rubicon Masonic Society. You may visit RubiconMasonicSociety.com/disclaimer for more information. As you all know, brothers and friends, these are not tiled meetings. Masons and non-Masons are more than welcome to attend and participate. So just please be mindful that anything discussed this evening should be suitable for all of those parties. Gentlemanly manners are to be expected at all times. No alcohol, no smoking, no eating, no foul language will be permitted. No discussion of politics or religion. Please, with the exception of the topic of tonight's presentation, of course. Quick recommendations. Of course, we'd like everyone to look their best, so please dress in coat and tie. Please type your name and any appropriate Masonic titles under your video to identify yourself to others. If you're not a Mason, thank you for being with us. Just simply type guest after your name. Please be sure to enable your video camera so all attendees can see you, reduce background noise, keep your microphone muted when not speaking, turn off all other distractions, and please be patient should any technical difficulties occur, brothers. Tonight's presenter is Brother Darrin Gulla, officer of Lexington Lodge No. 1, delivering a presentation on a history of Catholic-Freemason relations. And Worshipful Brother Bizak has the honors of introducing our special guest tonight.
Thank you, brother. Darrin Gulla, PhD, is a Master Mason at Lexington Lodge No. 1. He's a founding member of the Rubicon Masonic Society, and he's also a member of the Lexington Scottish Rite. He served as senior deacon and is currently the Tyler at our lodge. Brother Gulla is a native of Memphis, Tennessee. He's an economist by trade and taught in the economics department here at the University of Kentucky for 12 years. He left the university and is currently an investment advisor with Transamerica Financial Advisors. We've heard Darrin's presentation on the history of Catholic-Freemason relations in various lodges, and we thought it was most suitable for us to present tonight at Rubicon. Brother Darrin, the floor is yours.
All right,
Thank you, Worshipful Brother John, for that nice introduction. It was a compliment, as you are an intender and a mentor. A little inside baseball from our last Rubicon Masonic Society dinner. But so I will be talking about a subject here that most of us probably have a rough idea about, but probably don't know a lot about the details. And this also actually piggybacks really nicely off of the talk we had at the very beginning of the year with Most Worshipful Brother Terry Tilton, the Grand Lodge of Minnesota. If you haven't seen that episode, I would certainly check it out. It's on the YouTube page. But this is an important topic to me. I mean, I was raised in a pretty conservative Catholic environment, and I knew joining Freemasonry that there was some kind of friction between the two groups. But I assumed it was just something in the past. And when I was raised a Master Mason, I realized that, what we want to do here is pretty hard. And I need to rekindle that spiritual connection with my church that I had grown up in. And because I had kind of grown away, like a lot of Catholics have, Easter and Christmas, maybe Mother's Day. So I went to explore the relationship because I assumed it was something in the past, and find out a lot of things that were just really confusing to me. And real easy online to find lots of criticism of Freemasonry by Catholics. Kind of hard to find out what was right and what wasn't. So I reached out to and this is when I was teaching at the university. So I reached out to the Catholic Student Center there and said, hey, can I meet with somebody to find out what the deal is with this? And so I met up with Father Steve for a cup of coffee. He didn't know anything about it. So I hand him all the stuff that I'd printed offline, which didn't make sense to me. But he immediately says, oh, this is problematic. And so we kind of talked through things, and I expressed my confusion, how this was nothing I had encountered. And he says, well, let me just run it up the line to the diocese and see what they say. Well, I get an email from Father Steve about a week later, praying for my soul and suggesting that I leave this crazy organization. So I immediately did leave an organization, the Catholic Church, and joined an Episcopal church. But so that's the background that kind of motivated me to explore this. And so I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint presentation. Brian, if you could give me control here.
Yep. You should be able to share your screen now, brother.
Okay. Oh, shoot. Oh, wait a minute. I think I might have just disabled it. Am I sharing?
No, you're glitching up a little bit on my end.
Okay, well, so I just click the share screen button.
If you hit share screen, another window will pop up just to confirm the window that you're trying to share.
Oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing is what I get a pop up.
Somebody find that web guy, will you? And our mind. Let 1 second, brother. All right, try now.
Here we go.
Here we go. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, now how do I get in the?
You go to the bottom right, presenter view. Click that. Keep going to the right. Next one, that one right there. Click that.
Great. Oh, I need to go back to the beginning. All right, so a lot of groups over the years have expressed some criticisms of Freemasonry, a lot of religious groups. And so we can see Salvation Army at one point, Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland, the Methodist Conference of England, and then more recently, the Southern Baptist Convention. And I came across that in a really nice book by John Robinson called The Pilgrim's Path. That's actually a book worth taking a look at because it's quite eye-opening for me. I wasn't familiar with that. But the Roman Catholic Church has clearly been the strongest critic of Freemasonry and has issued 21 proclamations against our order by 8 different popes. Now, we're not going to go through all 21 proclamations here. That would take way too long and be way too tedious, but we'll explore some of those to get an idea of what's going on here. And so despite all these missives that we have, and also going forward, just to keep things simple, when I'm not going to say Roman Catholic Church 1,000 times this evening, I'm just going to say the church. So don't get confused. I'm not talking about the Methodist Church or anything like that, specifically the Roman Catholic Church, just a shorthand there. So because despite all these missives, 21 proclamations, a lot of confusion exists within the craft as to why the church has adopted its approach towards Freemasonry, and as well as the current status of Catholic Masonic relations. So we're going to look at some of the major developments here, so that way we can figure out what it is people are saying about us, and then also to provide good counsel to our own brethren and more importantly, potential petitioners. So whenever we want to think about the history of these relationships between Freemasonry and the Catholic Church, we have to look at 2 distinct phases in church jurisprudence. Now, I have here on the slide church jurisprudence regarding Freemasonry. This applies to everything within the church. But the first phase that we'll see is what we call the encyclicals. And so this is a textbook definition here. Official letters written by the Pope sent to all bishops in order to make a statement about the official teachings of the church. So that's going to be the first sort of series of things we'll take a look at. And there have been 21 of these over a couple 100-year period. Then the second phase that we'll explore, and this is where things get a little complicated and confusing, is we'll look at modern canonical law. So again, a textbook definition here. Systems of laws and legal principles made and enforced by the church's hierarchy to regulate its external organization and government, and to order and direct the activities of congregants towards the mission of the church. So we'll look at those 2 phases separately. So our first one here, we'll look at the encyclicals. And what I'll do is I'll look at the very first one, and then one of the very last ones, not the last one, but probably the most famous one, specifically against Freemasonry. So shortly following the arrival of Freemasonry onto the European continent, the church issued its first condemnation of the craft. Pope Clement XII in 1738 released In Eminenti Apostolatus, declaring that Freemasonry represents a threat to the teaching of the church as well as to secular governments. Now, one note here, these encyclicals are typically titled after the opening phrase of the particular writings. So that's why this sounds like a rather strange title, In Eminenti Apostolatus. I'll shorten it down to just In Eminenti. But so in the tract, Clement imposes the penalty of excommunication reserved to the papal see on all members and supporters of the craft, and further commands church officials, including inquisitors, as well as secular authorities, to pursue and punish these transgressors as, and this is a quote here, being most suspect of heresy. So another side note here, I'll have to add some insights on some of these Catholic terms here. Let's see here. So excommunication reserved to the papal see, as we see here. What that means is that if you've had excommunication filed against you for anything, in this case, of course, for being a Freemason, and you wanted to appeal that judgment, you got to go all the way to the top. This guy right here is who you'd have to talk to. You can't get a local bishop to seek reprieve for you. That's not how it works. So this encyclical is rather short and vague in the language to justify such an extreme form of punishment. And actually, you come across terms like common gossip and rumor. Not exactly something that instills confidence in an official document, but nonetheless, that's the language that we encounter there. So the offenses which Clement levels against the craft that apparently merit excommunication and possibly torture, where inquisitors are sent out here to ferret out this problem. So here are the issues that Clement has with Freemasonry. It's non-sectarian in nature, its use of oaths, its secrecy, its lack of civil or canonical sanctions, and the fifth one, and this is my favorite, again, this is a direct quote, other just and reasonable motives known to us. No elaboration, that's just what Clement declares. So these charges on their face value don't really appear to warrant such harsh measures. So maybe there's some other elements at play here. And so Worshipful Brother Christopher Powell of Royal Brunswick Lodge 296, Sheffield United Grand Lodge of England, states flatly that in eminenti is wholly political in intent. So what is this political nature? So if we look at the first, almost the opening lines within the encyclical, we see this line here, and I'm reading directly. Certain societies, companies, assemblies, and congregations or conventicles, called in the popular tongue Liberi Moratori or Francs Masons, or by other names according to the various languages, are spreading far and wide and daily growing in strength. So people are joining the craft pretty quickly, and that's kind of creating some concern. So maybe we might want to say, can we get an idea of the rate? The rate might be pretty fast. I don't have numbers on that, but my guess is it's probably not. I mean, this is still pretty soon from Freemasonry coming to the continent. Maybe it's not just the rate at which folks are joining the craft, but who the people are that are joining it. So we take a look at this, we can see Francis I, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and he's an interesting player here because he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. And if you're not up to speed with sort of papal history, the Pope isn't, and this will come up again later, the Pope isn't just the leader of some church. And going back into history, he also is a temporal leader of a kingdom and swaths of land throughout Italy, known as the Papal States. And popes in the past fought to maintain their lands and to expand their kingdoms. So they fought people like the Holy Roman Emperor and kings of France and all this. So this is really so it's important that someone that's viewed as a threat to the Pope on a temporal level is probably being noticed. And there's actually a really funny story about Francis here. The inquisitors had gotten the drop on him and were real close to apprehending him. And they really wanted to get their hands on him because if we can excommunicate some guy who's in line to one of our enemies, we're in good shape. You could, maybe that's the thinking going on by Clement. But so they track him down to a house of ill repute, I guess is the best word to use. And while they're banging on the door, kind of interrupting a private moment he was having, he collects his clothes and jumps out the window and runs away. So he lives to survive another day. But sorry for that digression there. But Frederick, the Prince of Wales, is also joined. Frederick, the Crown Prince of Prussia. The French philosopher Montesquieu. So these guys have all joined Freemasonry. And the King Louis XV of France is an overt supporter, though clearly not a member of the Brotherhood. And another key element here, and this was something that I had really hard time wrapping my brains around, I guess because I just don't know enough of the historical details, but Freemasonry appeared to be some sort of fulcrum on the continent of some kind of Cold War that was being waged between the Jacobite movement, supporting the now Catholic Stuart claim to the English crown, and the existing Protestant Hanoverians. A whole lot of double dealing and shady actions and infighting between these camps, and it involves people that I just don't know, and they all use titles, and you're like, well, I don't know who Sussex is, and that kind of thing. So that's something we're not going to explore, but it was clearly a role. So you get some idea of some political elements there. And so while we're not going to go through a whole bunch of these separate encyclicals, over the next 150 years or so, there's a dozen encyclicals, all kind of reinforming these findings that we see here from in eminenti, but they all are sort of have a feature that they all reflect some sort of a political element going on within the continent. And then they all seem to be focused on different elements. But they all have that commonality that they're all kind of political in nature. So let's jump about 150 years to one of the last encyclicals, not the last, but one of the last. So in 1884, Leo, in his encyclical, the Humanum Genus, levels the most full-throttled attack on Freemasonry. In this prolonged denouncement, Leo reconfirms the ipso facto right of excommunication to all Catholics who join Freemason lodges. So again, a little bit more definitional terms. A few years earlier, Leo here issued another encyclical against Freemasonry and added this idea of ipso facto. So what that means in Latin, as you can probably guess, is by its nature, in and of itself, you can say. So if you are a Freemason, you in and of itself, that means you are excommunicated. So that was added to, that feature was added. But anyway, so this excommunication to all Catholics who join Freemason lodges. So more importantly, and this is something I hope we can explore a lot more in the discussion time period at the end. So more importantly, Leo declares that Freemasons observe a religion of naturalism that runs counter to the teachings of the church. So, and I mentioned Most Worshipful Terry Tilton gave a talk at the beginning of the year, and it focused a lot on this idea of naturalism. And he's way more informed on the topic than I am, but I'm going to try my best here. So what is naturalism? And this is, again, it's a strict dictionary definition here. The philosophical belief that everything arises from nature, from natural properties and causes, and that supernatural or spiritual explanations are excluded or discounted, relying on reason rather than divine revelation. So in this system, there's no supreme being that's actively participating in the physical world. So again, I would strongly recommend, if you didn't watch this earlier presentation, to jump on YouTube and watch Most Worshipful Terry Tilton. He explains this much better than I will. Okay. Now, another thing that you should probably explore as well is this encyclical itself. The Humanum Genus, you can find it for free online. I would strongly recommend reading it. You read it sometimes and you're like, wow, I can't believe this guy even wrote this. But the version I have has the Latin translation and the English, and more importantly has Albert Pike's response. He wrote a personal letter to Pope Leo in Latin, not too surprising. The version I have just has the English version, but it's definitely worth the read. We'll explore some of the items within that work. But this point about naturalism, and as you see, these are some of the kind of conclusions here. We'll go through those. But one point to note here is that the church, again, I'm talking about the Roman Catholic Church, sees itself as a universal and only source of truth. It considers it a monopoly whereby no salvation in any way can be obtained outside of its tenets. So any group that considers itself offering an alternative path, or even tolerating the possibility of an alternative path, obviously like us, thereby practices religious relativism that must be suppressed. So take a look at these errors that Leo believes Freemasonry suffers from on account of this naturalism that he thinks that we observe. So a separation of church and state, religious tolerance and freedom of conscience. Now, remind you, he's criticizing us for saying these things. So this third one here, this is where the problem that I have with his conclusions are, and hopefully we can discuss this further. Rejection of divine revelation, and then last, equal rights under the law. So if I were standing in front of Pope Leo, if he were obviously still alive, I would say, I'm sorry, guilty as charged, other than this one right here. Other than that third one, I'm sorry, we are as Freemasons guilty of those. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But you can get a sense that in this encyclical has often been described as really a screed against enlightenment. And that's basically the nuts and bolts of Albert Pike's response to the encyclical. And like, for example, I'm not going to read this verbatim from the text, but when in this section where Leo, looks like my video is doing some funky things. Back to normal. Okay. So under this section of equal rights in the law, Leo says things like, some people are just inherently inferior than others, and they just need to know their place. And what is this talk about representative government? He's not up to that at all. So it's quite remarkable. But one thing that Leo is certainly doing is he's lashing out in a number of things that are unfolding during the late 19th century, and he's kind of combining everything into Freemasonry. So he writes like maybe 6 or 7 encyclicals directly at Freemasonry, and they all seem to basically reflect some other kind of element that he's just blaming on us. So he notes that, and this is a direct quote, there are several sects of men, though different in name and custom and form and origin, are identical in aim and sentiment with Masonry. It is the universal center from which they all spring and to which they all return. So again, the Humanum Genus, I didn't mention this at first. It basically translates into the spirit of the age. So Leo is not happy with how the spirit of the age is unfolding in the late 1800s, and he's essentially placing the blame on Freemasonry. And so Leo asserts that these several sects that are derived from Freemasonry are atheists, communists, and socialists, who all have a specific aim. And that is, just kind of sum up this, the desire of overthrowing all the religious and social orders introduced by Christianity and building a new one according to its taste based on the foundation and laws of naturalism. So that's the conclusion that he's making here. And we have to be really careful with the language here. So the religious and social orders introduced by Christianity, well, Leo means something very specific when he says that. This Christianity here means him, means the Catholic Church. So he's basically, ranting about everyone in the world that's not a Catholic, not just Freemasons. So that's why he's complaining about the spirit of the age. Now, to be fair, I'm sure, especially on the European continent, that there were lodges that were co-opted and working in tandem with some of these groups. But most modern regular Freemasons would hardly recognize this description of Freemasonry in the craft. So that, like I said, it wasn't the last encyclical, but it was one of the few left. I think Leo cranks out a few more. But at the turn of the century, there's this movement within the church to try to streamline, church law. So you've got thousands of often conflicting papal laws and decrees spanning centuries. So Pope Pius the 10th in 1904 convenes the First Vatican Council, and it says he establishes some kind of commission to compile and reconcile these things. I mean, some of these things, these encyclicals completely contradict each other, and some are just very anachronistic. My favorite one, I think it might have been Urban or Clement, it was in the late 1000s, like 1096. So there was an encyclical on the record prior to ultimately what becomes the first canonical law system, banning the crossbow. And then a few years later, Urban has to issue another encyclical saying, well, it's okay to use the crossbow if you're using it against non-Christians. Because he had just issued the First Crusade. So that kind of gives you a flavor of what was going on, what they were dealing with. So they want to compile and streamline all this law, and they ultimately, takes them a couple years, compose the Codex Juris Canonici, which, since that's a bit of a mouthful, I'll just call the 1917 Codex. So generally, it obviously doesn't focus a whole lot on Freemasonry, but it does represent a continuation of prior positions regarding Masonry. So specifically, we have Canon 2335. And so it says, those who join a Masonic sect or other societies of the same sort, which plot against the church or against legitimate civil authority, incur ipso facto excommunication, simply reserved to the Holy See. So now that canon might seem pretty straightforward, but in practice, it's a little bit trickier. And not being an expert in law and the sausage making of law in and of itself, it was tricky reading through a lot of this stuff here, because not only is the legal process and government process where laws are created is kind of tricky, put it in a church setting becomes even trickier. So in the discussions, while that, it took them 15 years almost to compile this codex. So there's a lot of discussion going on back and forth, and so you can kind of peek into certain issues. Like they basically have timetables and they issue basically rough draft type things, and you can see what was going on in the discussion that makes this law a little bit more complicated than it would seem. So the first off, they basically implement a two-part rulemaking process, I guess is the best way to say it. So the first one is the Catholic must have enrolled in the membership books of an organization, like a lodge. And in the discussion of why this was added in there, is you can kind of get an idea. So when Leo first established that ipso facto excommunication, again, that's just in and of itself, what you ended up happening is that you saw people filing charges against somebody on Freemasonry for self-interest. It's like one guy owns, is upset that his competitor in the fish market in Naples is making more money than he is. He accuses him of being a Freemason. So apparently that was quite common. And they said, look, we need to actually make sure they're Masons before we excommunicate them and ruin their lives. And then the second component, so there's an and here. So it's a two-part process that is necessary for the excommunication sentence to be issued. And the organization had to be wholly devoted to heretical or subversive ends. And so in practice, this two-part test proves rather difficult. And this was added in primarily by U.S. church members, because while there might have been some funny business going on with lodges in Europe, lodges in the U.S. were certainly not engaged in activity trying to overthrow the papacy or whatnot. So I think that's why that was added in here specifically, because U.S. lodges were not devoted to subversive ends like overthrowing the church. And so that seems to be added in there. So you have a two-part process that basically ends up with a system, and again, especially in the U.S. and maybe different in other parts of the world, that leads to what we call pastoral sensitivity. That you would sit down and talk with your parish priests and say, well, here's what we do at the lodge, and we don't want to overthrow the church, and then everything's fine. And so you can see it. I came across a picture, I guess it was in the Boston Herald, maybe that's the Boston paper, back in the 1920s, where you would see Freemasons and the Knights of Columbus marching lockstep down the street for St. Patrick's Day parades. And oddly enough, they're dressed very similarly, which is interesting. Knights of Columbus being the sort of the Catholic Church's Freemasonry. But so I think during this time period, especially in the U.S., there was a lot of pastoral sensitivity. Maybe to some extent, it's kind of like a don't ask, don't tell policy, but it didn't really seem to create a whole lot of problems. But as the decades move along, the church finds itself in kind of a similar position that Leo was in. The spirit of the ages is changing. So in 1962, Pope John the 23rd convenes the Second Vatican Council, which we typically call today Vatican II, to reassess the church's position to better connect with the modern world. The world is changing. Sorry, I keep moving around and there's glare coming in from my windows. Sorry about that. I'll be more mindful not to move around so much. So the world is changing, and they want to try to, and my guess, I don't know this for certain, but my guess is that membership rolls in Catholic churches are probably diminishing during this time period. So there's a specific goal to foster a spirit of what we call ecumenism, reaching out to groups that had previously opposed. So a big goal of this particular Vatican Council was to update the Codex. That ultimately is completed in 1983. Again, I'll just call that the 1983 Codex. But what we see from this Codex is Freemasonry disappears. But if you were to get online and do a Google document search or PDF search of the 1983 Codex, you're not going to find the word Freemasonry. It has been completely extracted. So we're not in there at all. And also the sentence of excommunication doesn't exist. But Canon 2335, that was that two-part step that was first created in the 1917 Codex has been replaced with two separate canons. The first one, 1364, against heretics and apostates, and the second one against subversive societies that plot against the church. So now, those obviously aren't directly related to Freemasonry. They're related to all sorts of other groups. But you could say that maybe we were lumped into that category. So you might think, well, the 1983 Codex doesn't have anything about Freemasonry, no excommunication, everything's fine. We're not heretics, apostates, and we're definitely not plotting against the church. And again, that seemed to be kind of a continuation of the pastoral sensitivity that really came out of the 1917 Codex, even though there was an excommunication if that two-part test was fulfilled. So you would think that's the case, but the problem is there's a lot lurking around in the background. So I call this period the interregnum. I couldn't think of a better word. So that time period from the start of Vatican II to the publication of the 1983 Codex, there's a lot going on in the background that's going to muck up things and make things a little bit confusing. But the first thing that's a good sign is there's a lot more outreach. That's the whole idea of ecumenism. So you see a number of groups that start meeting with Freemason lodges. Scandinavian Bishops' Conference, Bishops of England and Wales, Auxiliary Bishops of Paris. Now, these last two we're going to explore in a little bit more detail. So this one here, Innsbruck Convention of 1969. So this is a major breakthrough here in Catholic Masonic relations. So you have a commission of bishops under the direction of Cardinal Franz Koenig of the Secretariat for Non-Believers and Cardinal Franjo Shaper of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith met with Freemasons in Innsbruck, which I believe is in Austria, excuse me, not Australia. And so, but again, one quick thing before we talk about their conclusions. This term, Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Add a little bit of backstory here. I'm just going to call that CDF. It's what everybody else calls it because it's a lot shorter. But if you want to think of a good analogy, at least in the US, the CDF is kind of like the Supreme Court. It basically interprets church law and how it should be applied. So the CDF is a pretty important, probably the most important office within the Catholic Church in establishing dogma, basically. And more commonly, it's referred to as the Inquisition. So it is a pretty important component, and so it's going to play an important role here. But so the head of the CDF is leading this Innsbruck Convention, and their conclusions are quite positive. They issue the Lichtenau Declaration the following year, and where they can conclude that we are of the opinion that papal bulls, encyclicals, concerning Freemasons are now only historically significant and no longer relevant to our time. We are of the same opinion regarding ecclesiastical law since in light of what has been said, they cannot be justified by a church that follows God's commandment in teaching fraternal love. Well, so that's pretty positive. And so you see the head of the group that is interpreting, say, Canon 2335, saying, hey, these guys clearly are not trying to overthrow the church. They should be fine. Okay. Now, a couple of years later, now remember, the codex hasn't been completed yet by this time. It's still in the process of being developed. And Shaper issues a CDF declaration in 1974. Oddly enough, and this is something we're going to explore a little bit more detail here in just a second, this thing is never published, is not published until 7 or 8 years later. A little odd. But so his conclusion with how to interpret Canon 2335, remember that's at this point in time in 1974 is church law relating to Freemasonry with that two-part test. So he says, when considering particular cases, it must be borne in mind that criminal law is subject to a strict interpretation. Therefore, the opinion of those authors who maintain that the aforementioned Canon 2335 only contemplates those Catholics who give their name to associations that actually plot against the church can be taught and applied with complete certainty. So what he's saying there is that, as I mentioned, this idea of pastoral sensitivity, which was probably being implemented, or at least carried out to further that 1917 Codex, especially in the U.S., does apply. That pastoral sensitivity makes sense. If this guy's in a lodge that wants to overthrow the church, well, clearly we're going to excommunicate him. Excuse me. But more than likely, that lodge is not subversive, and everything's fine. Well, that would be great if that was the end of the story. Well, we also have the German Bishops' Conference. Remember, they started in 1974. They finally finished their work in 1980, led by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. And so he's at this time, well, he's cardinal now by the time this conclusions are issued in 1980. In 1974, he was an archbishop of a couple places. Let's see, where is it? He was the Archbishop of Munich and Freising, German guys. And hopefully that name, Joseph Ratzinger, rings a bell. He becomes Pope Benedict the 26th, I think. So he becomes Pope. But so notice by 1980, he's a cardinal. That's important. He comes to a conclusion that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense compared to the Lichtenau doctrine. He declares that Freemasons have not essentially changed. Membership places the foundations of Christian existence in existence. Detailed investigation of Masonic rituals and fundamental ideas and of their current unchanged self-understanding make clear. Simultaneous membership in the Catholic Church and Freemasons is incompatible. Now, this is just a conclusion from this meeting. So this is not church law. This is nothing. This is just his opinion, which is exact opposite of what Shapair had concluded just a few years earlier from the Innsbruck meeting. So now this is where things get even more complicated. So in 1983, Joseph Ratzinger pops up again, and he issues a CDF declaration. That means he's now running the CDF. So Shapair was running it, issued the Lichtenau doctrine that was very favorable of Freemasonry. Ratzinger now is head of the CDF, and he issues a completely different conclusion, or it issues a statement from the CDF that's quite different than what Shapair had issued. And we got to remember, this is probably the dirtiest pool you could possibly imagine. So Ratzinger is at the head of the CDF at this point in time. 1983 is when the Codex is set to be released. As a matter of fact, this declaration that Ratzinger issues comes out an hour before the 1983 Codex goes into effect. So November 23rd, I think, 1201, November 23rd, the 1983 Codex becomes official canon law. Remember, we said that took away everything about Freemasonry, took out all excommunication, all that kind of language, and really only said that it applies to people that want to overthrow the church. And so his conclusion is quite a bit different with this. And he says, therefore, the church's negative judgment in regard to Masonic associations remains unchanged, since the principles have always been considered irreconcilable with the doctrine of the church, and therefore membership in them remains forbidden. The faithful who enroll in Masonic associations are in a state of grave sin and may not receive Holy Communion. So basically what this shows is how Ratzinger had his hands were kind of tied here a little bit. He knows that the declaration comes out in an hour and a half, and he issues this statement. I mean, think about what this means. For another analogy, we said that the CDF was kind of like the Supreme Court. Well, this would be like saying Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts issues a brief as his position as the head of the Supreme Court of the U.S. on some law that hasn't even been passed out of Congress. That's essentially what he's doing. But he knows his hands are tied a little bit. So he knows he cannot establish excommunication. That's not in the law. So he uses this term grave sin. In the Latin term, and this is a very specific church term, peccato gravi versantur. So that means something very different than excommunication. So he can say, well, by his authority, he can refuse Catholic Masons from receiving Holy Communion. He can't excommunicate them. There's nothing he can do about that. That's in the in the code, but he is going ahead and interpreting the code this way, which is exactly opposite of how Shapehair had interpreted the code. Because the 1983 code essentially embodies this idea of pastoral sensitivity that is kind of implied in the 1917 code. But so this makes things all the more confusing. So the 1917 or the new 1983 codex says nothing about Freemasonry. There's no excommunication or anything like that, but it's being interpreted by the head of the CDF as basically status quo ante. So what's the conclusion? And that's a little bit tricky. And this is something that I had trouble interpreting, because there are different interpretations. There are different conclusions. Either you think that this CDF statement does have standing in sort of a kind of a church court setting, so to speak, or it doesn't. And there's arguments on both sides. Some argue, hey, this is a CDF publication or judgment, and even though the Pope never signed off on it, he didn't talk about against it either. So that's the kind of state we're in, why we have a lot of confusion here, and there's really no resolution. And some have argued that you've got Pope Francis running things now, who's the definition of ecumenism and has reached out to just about every group that the church has had problems with other than Freemasonry. And some have argued that at least prior to, since I first wrote this paper, Ratzinger has passed away. But some had argued, well, once Pope Emeritus Ratzinger, you remember he stepped down from the papacy. Once he passed away, maybe that there'll be an outreach. We're not sure on that, though. During this time period, the Vatican did approve of the publication by an Austrian priest and member of the Vatican Council for Interreligious Dialogue, a gentleman named Michael Heinrich Wenninger, to publish a book called Lodge and Altar. And he comes to the same conclusion as the guys from Innsbruck and the Lichtenau document. He says that unequivocally, Freemasonry is indeed compatible with church teachings. Unfortunately, that book has not been translated into English, so I haven't been able to read his conclusions. But what I think it really created the issues with the confusion nowadays with us as Freemasons is that interregnum period that I mentioned reflects a fundamental issue and dynamic within the church. There was the Vatican II pushed for this sort of more of a progressive ecumenism, and that wasn't received well by everybody in the church. Hardline, more conservative folks often ignored Vatican II and still do to this day. So I think actually Freemasonry has kind of got caught up in a little bit of inside baseball within the church. That one reason why we haven't seen any relief like other groups might have from Pope Francis nowadays is that conflict is still going on. The conservative elements within the church went bananas when Francis became Pope, and they can't stand him. Francis, right when the COVID outbreak happened, got together with other leaders of religions around the world and led a prayer, help humanity from this deadly outbreak. And he got roasted by the more conservative elements within the church for doing that. And so that reflects some of the criticisms within in Freemasonry. One thing I can do is I would like to kind of start a discussion, if I can figure out how to do this. I do have the conclusions in a separate document from that German Bishops' Conference. So I'd like to kind of pull that up as well. Now I'll do a new share here. And this might be hard to read. So that may be hard to read. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but most of these things all talk about this idea of naturalism. So Masons, so the very first one here, Masons promote a freedom from dogmatic adherence to any one set of revealed truth. Such a subjective relativism is in direct conflict with the revealed truths of Christianity. Again, these German bishops have one notion of Christianity. It may not be yours. It may not be that of millions of other people around the world. So Masons deny the possibility of an objective truth, placing every truth instead in a relative context. So Masons hold a relative notion of religions as all currently seeking the truth of the absolute. Well, I think that goes without saying, I would think. So the Masons have a deistic notion of God. Again, this kind of links back to Worshipful Brother Tilton's discussion a few months ago. The deistic notion of God precludes the possibility of God's self-revelation to humankind. That was the exact reason why I wanted to open up the talk with that EA prayer, vouchsafe thine aid. It clearly shows that we desire and we actively seek God to reveal himself to us. So in Masonic toleration, there's a whole bunch of other things here. I'm going to maybe unshare this, but if you have, I would love to hear some insights on this idea of naturalism, a little bit more detail, and sort of some criticisms and that y'all might have, at least some answers to some of these criticisms. That would be fantastic. I mean, I can stop sharing this if you want, or I can leave it up there. It's up to you, Brian, because that wraps up my walk down memory lane here.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah, let me take the screen back and then we can begin the conversation from there.
Perfect. Do I need to hit stop share?
Please. Thank you, brother. So, give me 1 second. Okay. So, brothers, that was a very interesting conversation, and I think we can probably get a little bit deeper in it as far as the emotional side of it. So, Darrin, I know you enjoy engaging in the conversation. So, what are some specific topics or questions or concerns that you think maybe some of our participating brothers have?
Well, I think I would love to hear, and we got a little bit of this from Tilton's discussion. I would like to hear some impacts or insights from the guys on the that are joining us here on their thoughts of this idea that certainly the German Bishops' Convention has, and a lot of hardline conservatives have as well, or in that matter, Pope Leo the 13th or whatever. But do you think Masonry advances a position where God doesn't reveal himself to us? I don't think Masonry does that. They're basically asserting, and to use the analogy that most Worshipful Brother Tilton applied, is that this natural religion, especially deistic, viewed God as the divine watchmaker. Can compose this beautiful piece of machinery, wound up the gears and set it down and let it operate. Or Brother Mario, I can't remember where he was from. I had a good analogy where he said, a deistic or natural view of God is that he parks the car, gets out, tosses the keys to the valet, and just carries on and lets the world run itself. I don't believe that's true, and I don't think Freemasonry advances that either. Mm-hmm. Could be my biases and prejudices that are not seeing it. Maybe I'm just not, my eyes aren't open to it, but I just don't see how you conclude that from anything we do. So I would love to hear feedback from there. I see some hands being raised, especially by Worshipful Brother Rich Hansen. And I even actually sent this material to him a week ago, hoping to get his feedback, because I know he's a very spiritual guy, and I'd love to hear what he has to say. I know we got other folks with their hands up. So I will turn it over here. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this.
Excellent.
It would have been nice if I was able to present every single one of these conclusions on the German Bishop Conference in a more easily digestible way, and that might have kind of furthered discussion a little bit. But I'm open to hear thoughts on that.
Brother Cameron, why don't you go first, since you were the first to raise your hand, please?
Yes, thank you, brethren, and those and others. The first thing I want to raise is the issue of the Catholic Church. Now, I belong to an Anglican church, which is a Church of England, which was established by I'm trying to think. Anyway, he wanted to get a divorce from the church, and the Pope wouldn't allow it. And so I wanted you to narrow your focus when you refer to Catholic Church to that of the Roman Catholic Church under the Pope or under Rome, as opposed to other Catholic churches. King Henry VIII was the one I was thinking of.
Right, that's a fair point. I
also-
did note that at the very beginning, that I'm shortening things down to just the church. So, but you're very right.
I was going to point that out, but you beat me to it. That's fine. But at the same time, when we look at, and I was going to make reference to the fact that the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, established by Henry VIII, has what we call in our canon law the Henry VIII clauses, which are the get out clauses. And I noticed that in your presentation, there seemed to be some sort of way where these edicts from various popes along the way could be interpreted as an all-in clause. If you are a Freemason or a member of another like-minded body, you will be excommunicated, or the Pope himself will make a determination that you will be that you are excommunicated. And how many people along the way who are Freemasons, members of the church, actually got a decision from the Pope at the time to excommunicate them? I would say that would be very, very fair.
Yeah, go ahead.
And the other side of that would be that and the other side of that, it's based on interpretation. And as we've seen along the line during your presentation, various popes, cardinals, and the like have taken various views along the way. They sit in the middle of the road, and they just swerve from one side of the road to the other. When it comes to making a determination as to whether or not to excommunicate you, determine whether you're part of an organisation that is against church doctrine or the like. I seek your views on that.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think that's why I divided up the presentation into this period of encyclicals where popes would issue statements, and that's just the law of the land, compared to our modern canonical law, where a lot of what you're talking about, the nuances came out a lot more under the canonical law, and that created probably a lot more confusion amongst us as the craft. But most of the encyclicals almost seemed rather arbitrary. They typically are reacting to some event. So, for example, during that time period that I skipped out, there was a rough encyclical that I don't think it was Leo, but I think it was someone right before him, that was chastising people for wanting to separate education from the Catholic Church. They wanted essentially a more secular type of education, because if you wanted to get schooling, you typically had to go to a Jesuit school back in that time period. And so they were writing in response to that. So most of those encyclicals have that feature to them. And as you say, it kind of seemed like it could be a little bit arbitrary. And so that's why I think there was this move, not just the issue with Freemasonry, but all elements of dogma in church positions for a modern canon law. So I hope that helps.
Thank you for your question, brother. Brother Rich.
Good evening, gentlemen. Worshipful Brother Darrin, I can't express how good this presentation is. You're always a fine presenter. And I appreciated you greatly sharing this paper with me about a week ago, being able to have some discussion online. It gave me kind of a heads up of some things to think about. But, you know, I grew up in church, and I must say, first and foremost, I have very little experience with the Catholic Church because I'm from the eastern side of Kentucky, and there's not a lot of Catholic churches around. They're here, but not a lot. But it's not exclusive to that, because we have pastors even in Free Will Baptist, Pentecostal. We have pastors here in our town that will search the parking lot for any kind of Masonic placards on the back of vehicles, so he can hound you once service is let out. So it's still going on across the land. But some things that I found very intriguing was when you and I talked about, you know, they stated that Freemasons don't believe in a God who participates in our world. I just don't understand where they can gather that information or feel right to be able to choose that. You know, when one organization, and I study some of the Catholic stuff too. I mean, there's a lot of good in that. But when you take the it's my way or the highway approach, shows a lot of fear. When anything is incompatible to your way only. I think number 6 on the conclusions is correct. It talks about Masonic toleration. It says the Masons promote a principle of toleration regarding ideas. Yeah, we absolutely do. That's what we're designed for. And I think the lack thereof and the fear just blatantly blares through because they just don't know. And that's across the board with anybody. We've seen so much online, you know, that discredits Freemasonry, and they just don't know. And that's from Satanism to you name it. And I just, you know, when you have the ignorance of not knowing, things can run amok. But that just shows the intense fear and political nature that was at least, and I think it still is, but at least the prevailing theme at that time. Can I ask you a question? And yes. I don't know this, you may not know this. Have the Catholics ever recovered or been able to have any factual evidence? And have they produced anything that they found that any Masonic lodges were conspiring against them?
Now that I don't know. My guess is they probably had some suspicions. So during one of the other encyclicals that Pope Leo had issued, where he was not happy about Freemasonry, had to do when Italy finally was reunified under King Victor Emmanuel II. And his main general was Giuseppe Garibaldi, who happened to be a Freemason. Just happened to be.
And many other things.
and plus, I mentioned in the very first encyclical, the In Eminenti, that there was a lot of inside baseball going, if that's really the best term. Basically, there was a big tug of war match over Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was the claimant to the English throne, which of course had stopped being Catholic, as Brother Cameron had pointed out, and they knew he was involved in Freemasonry, and a lot of times all the different groups were trying to pull him away from certain Masonic influences because they had different agendas. So some of these lodges might have been Jacobite in nature and specifically. And there's a lot of interesting so it gets so confusing, but apparently Chevalier Ramsey was right in the middle of that, and he had been his Charlie's tutor, and then he kind of had he started drifting away from Catholic stuff. He bounced around. It was the craziest story. I had trouble following it. So I think they do have some pretty good ideas that this stuff might have gone on because we're a secret organization.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And so I think in more modern times, I want to say that a lot of the sort of reactionary groups, especially in Latin America, I think use co-opted lodges for that express purpose. So I think, like I said, I think they've got some argument that there might have been some of that going on, but I think that was unique to certain circumstances, and certainly not really in U.S. lodges, that's for sure.
Sure. Yeah. I could see that being plausible. There's a little bit of politics in every place that you go. And I could see when you listed a lot of the high profile leaders at that time joining the Masonic institution, that's what I wrote to you online. I was surprised that the Catholic Church didn't follow suit in some form or fashion just to see what was going on and protect their interests. But instead, they just demonized the whole institution of fraternity. And yeah, I don't agree with their views at all on that.
So. I'll tell you what, there's two interesting points. I know Brother Cameron had asked this. Do we know about people that were kind of excommunicated? And we do, as a matter of fact. And if you read the book, let me go back to the cover page. One of our earlier presenters from last year, John Dickey, has an excellent book called The Craft: How Freemasons Made the Modern World. And he covered a few chapters of that last year. Again, if you didn't see that one, get on the YouTube chat and look for that one, because that was fantastic. And he has a discussion where he talks about an English guy who was in Portugal, a guy named John Costos. I guess that's how you pronounce his name. He and some other guys were tortured by the Inquisition in Lisbon for being Freemasons. And he wrote an expose about it. Now, it turns out, according to Dickey, he exaggerated a lot of stuff that happened to him. But if you read that response, I mentioned that my copy of the Humanum Genus had the response from Albert Pike, and you can find that probably online as well. You don't have to buy that particular book. And he lists. He was like, "Oh, well, you're criticizing us. Look how enlightened you are. You tortured these guys," and he lists. So it was not an insignificant number. It probably wasn't thousands of people, but especially in 1738, when the first encyclical came out, even though there were some high profile guys that were joining, Masonry was probably still pretty small. Mm-hmm. So you almost wonder, why was there this reaction, such a harsh reaction to probably a fairly insignificant organization? And I do have one other point I did want to bring up, Rich. This was mentioned in Most Worshipful Brother Tilton's talk. He recommended a book called The Workman Unashamed, A Testimony of a Christian Freemason by Christopher Hafner. And I've got it right here. I went and bought it. It's actually kind of hard to find online, even though it's not that book. But he has a chapter on deism. And this is something that I was just shocked about and was wishing that there was more explanation in the book here. He notes this could have a huge influence on the conclusions from the German Bishops' Conference. He notes that, let's see, many Masons have acquiesced in the view that the order is deistic. And I'm quoting from Hafner here. This is particularly true in Germany, where there are two basic types of initiation. One derived from Scandinavian and called Christian, because Trinitarian belief is necessary qualification for membership. And the other, derived more directly from England, is called deistic. So I don't know if that's the case. I reached out to past secretary of Lexington Lodge No. 1, Rick Barella, who was a member of a German lodge, to see if he had any insights on that. Fortunately, he's down in Florida, I think, getting some rest and recovery on his shoulder surgery. But I was hoping he would give me some insights on there. So if anybody knows anything about that, that would be great, because that clearly would have some influence on the conclusions that the German Bishops' Conference made. And what I have a sneaky suspicion about too is they met with these folks in Germany for 6 years. Now, I'm assuming they were cherry picking things. My guess is they left it open because they were, again, I think there's this internal struggle between more progressive and conservative elements within the church at that time period. And I think there was some biding time for the right instant to release those conclusions. And it's not too surprising that by the time the conclusion is issued, Ratzinger is a cardinal. Yeah. And a year later, he's head of the CDF. And of course, there's a very conservative pope going on that was installed, John Paul II. So I think there may even be some elements going on within the church that could be playing out.
Yeah, just intriguing, very intriguing story. I appreciate your time and just a wonderful presentation. You did a fabulous job. So thank you, Brother Brian, for your time.
Good to see you, brother. So, brothers, I want to open up just a general question. I'm just curious. Is there anyone here that believes that Freemasonry is a religion? If yes, raise your hand, put your virtual hand up. Anyone? You know, it's interesting because we constantly are continually told that Freemasonry is a religion, yet I have never found a single Mason anywhere on the planet that says we're a religion. So that's frustrating. Brother Gulla, I'm not Catholic, so this is a question that I'm just not sure. I'm just curious to get your opinion on. What is the Catholic Church's opinion of other religions, and their tolerance toward other religions? Do you have any input on
Well,
that?
I don't think they're particularly crazy about it. I mentioned how Pope Francis did this communal prayer with other religious leaders and got just trashed for it. But yeah, so I don't know. My guess is that, you know, and you noted from some of the, you know, these Catholic officials, they think, you know, that's Catholic means universal. To them, this is the only path to salvation. Their interpretation is the only way to do it. And you know, for most of its history, it had a monopoly on that thought. And then other thinkers came about and said, hey, maybe things are a little bit different. And so I think they still believe that every Protestant is a heretic. I think they're obviously more tolerant, but I think deep down and fundamentally, they believe that they're not going to be saved because they don't believe in the Catholic Church. That, I guess, but that's my interpretation of Catholic dogma. But you know, I'm not a member of the cloth or anything like that. So I don't think they're super crazy about it. And you know, obviously, I'm a little bit biased here. I joined an Episcopal church, and it is very tolerant. Now, of course, there could be Episcopal churches that aren't tolerant at all. Yeah. So I mean, and I think Rich touched on it a little bit. A lot of these features, and I hate to sound like I'm harping and criticizing the Catholic Church. A lot of these basic reactions exist across wide ranges of religions. And so I'm not signaling out the church just in this particular case.
Mark St. Cyr had a question, and he's presented to us before. Was your decision to leave the church based entirely on your position as a Freemason, or was it something other or in conjunction?
Not just because of being a Freemason. That basically pushed me over. You know, as was mentioned, I taught economics, and just like there might have been a conflict amongst progressive and conservative elements within the Catholic Church, there are heated discussions amongst more progressive and free market economists. I'm more on the free market side of things. And so as I was studying economics in graduate school, I got really frustrated with the role of the church as a monopolist. And that sort of rubbed me the wrong way. And so I started exploring, not that I was losing faith, but just exploring different options. And so it had been kind of building for a while. I had actually gone to a whole bunch of different churches here in Lexington before I was raised. You know, once I raised, though, I knew that I was like, I've got to get back into more active church life to help me be a better man and Mason. And it was odd that I wanted to return to my roots, and that door was closed on me. And so I went to essentially a Catholic church that doesn't have a pope. But so that just, there was a combination. I wouldn't say it was just, you know, so don't hang me out there as this martyr of Freemasonry. Those dang Catholics ostracized me, so I changed churches. I think that was really more of a compilation of things. Just said, hey, I need to be in a more inclusive church.
Brother Ratliff asked a question. So if someone is Catholic and interested in Freemasonry, what advice would you give that person?
Yeah, I saw that pop up. That's a great question. And actually, in the paper, the full-length paper of this will be available to read soon when the proceedings of the Rubicon Masonic Society are finally published, which sounds like they're coming soon. So you can read this for just $40. Shameful plug. Along with many other excellent pieces of work. So I actually wrap up the paper with, so as Freemasons, to answer Worship Brother Ratliff's question, as Freemasons, we need to be candid with our Catholic brethren, and especially petitioners, that the current situation in the Catholic Masonic relationship is unclear, and they should consult with their families and parish priests. The best rule, in my mind, I think, this is really getting to what Robbie was asking. The best rule is to follow your conscience, I think.
Yeah. Brother Gerald, you have a question?
Not exactly. My usual approach is wanting to share my answers. You guys have already homed in on the main thing, and that is a Catholic that means universal. It was founded as a monopoly, and they have defended their monopoly ever since. The thing in your presentation, Brother Darrin, that really caught me was one of them that I don't think that you got quite to reading, a more detailed one that was talking about Freemasonry doesn't allow for the Mason to have a personal relationship with deity. And I think that that's entirely wrong. I think that it is exactly opposite. And this comes down to the main thing that we're talking about, and that is tolerance. We let every man choose his own path. And that certainly includes having a relationship directly with God. If there's any institution in the world that interferes with that and has always interfered with that was Catholicism. The reason that there was a Reformation was because here again were the Germans coming in and saying, you're selling salvation. That's not right. And then that the Catholic Church, that was when they first were starting into saying, we are your link to salvation. We are, the church is your link to God. And anything that interfered with that, they were against. And tolerance is, and intolerance is one of the two fundamental problems with religion. The big problem with religion is as it becomes institutionalized, the institution and its protection and its carrying on its business becomes more important than our relationship with deity, and that needs to be shut down. And if anybody gives it a moment of real thought, whatever or whoever God is the same for everybody. All of the religions are a product of their time and place as to ways to commune with the divine. That's why Freemasonry is so important in world history, is not teaching that God has just given the keys and everybody's on their own. It is that we've always been able to have this direct relationship. The thing but most religions, where they go wrong is they decide their teaching is literally true and that only their teaching is true. So you've got things that are meant to be allegorical teachings, as certainly things like the Garden of Eden and Jonah and the whale and the ark. Those have to be allegories. We know enough now as a species that the first human wasn't a human in a modern sense, and all of those things. And the Catholic Church has always thought that their best path was to suppress it. Same way when Galileo absolutely proved that we weren't at the center of the universe, and they showed him the tools of torture, and he said, "All right, I'm going to shut up. Somebody's going to bring this up again after I'm gone." But that's what it is about. We do have a deeply personal relationship with the deity, but that personal relationship means that it gets defined by our relationship with God, not one that some church lays down their rules and says, if you break my rule, I can break your relationship with God because I can excommunicate you and nobody else goes there. So this is a really great presentation, Brother Darrin, and you other discussers. We went right to this issue because it's so clearly the core of it. Shall you have a personal relationship with God, or do you have to go through this one monopoly and have them punch your ticket? And oh, I had one other comment. Want to know why that first big bull came out in 1738? 1736, you get the second iteration of Anderson's Constitution. They were basically a virtually invisible, let alone secret, invisible organization. 1717 comes along, the Constitution's in 1723. It starts to look like there may be a competitor in the religious world at that point. And then when the second Constitutions comes out, the ritual has been expanded to 3 degrees. It looks like we're here to stay. And I think that's when the Pope at that time said, we got to start pushing back on this.
Yeah, you might be onto something there. I know I mentioned some work, a piece of work by Worshipful Brother Powell over in England, and he talks about that particular anonymity, that something like that might have been a factor there too. He actually proposed. Now I don't think this is original to him. It could be, but very insightful. He notes that Clement at that time was like 95 years old, blind and sick, and that he probably didn't write it, but the guy who probably wrote it was his adjutant, who had been in, I think it might have been in the Archbishop of Paris, and knew all these players. I mentioned, Montesquieu and all that. So I think he knew some of the inside track maybe before it becomes much more public. So I think there might be something to that.
Well, and you look at what was in that those constitutions by Anderson, and one of them was something that you enumerated in your presentation. A lot of really prominent, influential, well-known, powerful people were revealed in that as being Masons, and the constitutions were dedicated to highly placed aristocratic Masons. In a lot of places, kings became more or less honorary Grand Masters, and before, and you see this going back to Henry II, who's when you study the history of British related law, and that was my field, was law. That whole thing that he had with Thomas à Becket, where the thing there was that the clergy were outside the authority of the king. So when he got the opportunity to replace the Archbishop of Canterbury, he said, "I'm going to put in my whoring buddy here as the Archduke of Canterbury." And like we always dream that when you get elevated to high authority, your higher conscience is going to come into it. That happened with Beck, and So he had to just say out loud in front of his nobles, will no one rid me of this troublesome priest? And they killed the guy. But that and then it was Henry VIII, as was noted before, who finally said, I'm the king here. We'll put up our own religion, and it changed very little from the Catholic religion ecclesiastically, other than that it's not a pope. So they're guarding their monopoly, and they don't like the idea that Freemasonry is inviting the best of men who are truly want to be moral, and telling them that's up to you to be more to be moral, and have a relationship with God. And that's saying you don't need the church. We don't, and that's why we have studiously avoided becoming a church. And it's the best decision Freemasonry ever made. And it's our gift to the world once people can be convinced to take it.
Thank you, Brother Jerry. Brother Bruce, one or two more questions, brothers. Brother Bruce, go ahead. You're muted. There you go. Bruce, you're muted.
Thought I pushed the right button. Now can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Gotcha.
Okay. I wanted to say to Brother Gerald, you are doing something, you brought up something, because I was thinking along somewhat along the same lines, but Brother Darrin, you talked about the intolerance, and I was reminded of when I was in seminary, all the various things that I learned about the Catholic Church. And then you study Martin Luther and him tacking his thoughts to the church door, and that the Catholic Church didn't like that too well. And I thought, I just recently saw the movie, which I think came out in the 60s, The Shoes of the Fisherman, if you all remember that, and was like, boy, I wonder what the Catholic Church's reaction and the Pope's reaction to that movie was when that came out. And the Anthony Quinn playing the part of the Pope and giving away the riches of the Catholic Church to put off hunger. What kind of condemnation the church did to that movie at that time might be something I'll have to look up in the near future. And my only other thing, and this is to remind us, and Brother Rich reminded me in saying that he's from Eastern Kentucky. I hope we would all keep the people of Eastern Kentucky in our hopes and our prayers and our thoughts. My brother and sister-in-law's church has been journeying down to there. There are still parts of Eastern Kentucky that still do not have electricity. They don't have cell phone service, and they are still in great need of help and our assistance. So if you know of any church or any organization in your area that is gathering stuff, especially non-electrical items, try to get them or give some money so that they can get some. My wife went with my sister-in-law to a rummage sale that they were allowed into beforehand, and things like hand can openers and clothespins and all those things that we take for granted nowadays, those people can still use because they don't have electricity. So thank you very much for letting me share.
Thank you, brother. So final two questions, if they have any questions or comments. Worship Brother Dan Kimball, do you have any questions for Darrin tonight? Come on, you got to put him on the spot.
I will first of all say, I'll just echo everyone else's comments. Brother Darrin, marvelous presentation, and thank you for taking the time to prepare this. And I know you have worked on this actually for quite a while, and I appreciate your effort on this. In listening to your presentation and in seeing on the screen the quotes that you posted, it strikes me that the church's position with respect to Freemasonry, and particularly coming when it did for the first time in 1738, is a particularly reactionary position. And it seems to be out of step with the rest of the church's approach to evangelism, if you will, with regard to other groups. And I'm curious as to whether or not you share that opinion.
Oh, I think you're exactly right. And the title, especially even if you go fast forward 150 years to Pope Leo's Humanum Genus, that is completely reactionary. And decades or so of things going against the church, and he basically just spazzes out. That's the only way you can read it. But I think you're right. There is sort of a a paradox there, but it does seem kind of contradictory in that this one group of ours seems to have this ire that they can't put aside. And I mean, could that be an accumulation of things? I know I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but there could be all sorts of things that are causing that. I don't know why it seems to persist so much, because as we've kind of noticed that we're not looking to overthrow their church, and we're not a group that doesn't believe in a God that is a deistic, if you will. So I don't know why that they're just hung up on this. I don't understand that, but it does seem to be conflicting in that. Well, there are lots of Masons around the world. I'm going to reach out to other people, but not this group. I still can't explain it. Yeah. Does that help?
Well, not only is it conflicting, but it appears that when given the opportunity to review or revise the official church position, when the church comes to Freemasonry, they tend to double down on their reactionary position, and I find that the most curious aspect of all.
Yeah, I find that odd too. I mean, I mentioned that, especially with the current Pope Francis, the Pope has reached out to almost every single group that goes contrary to Vatican dogma or church dogma, but it has reached out to them, but doesn't want to reach out to us. I don't understand it, and your guess is as good as mine.
Brother Darrin and worshipful Brother Brian, we do have a resident theologian on tonight. That's worshipful Brother Dave Cassessa. He's had his virtual hand up and down a couple of times. It's probably just because he doesn't know how to work his computer. But I would be interested in hearing his thoughts on tonight's presentation.
Well, I wanted to respond to Brian Evans. I went to a Catholic men's conference meeting about a month ago, and it was really scary. I was invited, and I didn't have anything else to do, so I decided to spend 8 hours on my Saturday and travel to Indiana. And it was actually a splinter group, hard right, a conservative Catholic group, and they basically, if you don't spend at least one day a week outside of an abortion clinic boycott picketing, you're not a good Catholic. One guy said, "Can you believe I was going up for communion and a guy was wearing a Masonic ring and I just turned around and left and wrote a letter to the church?" And I was, wow. But that is the opinion of a few that is becoming more popular. Our Pope right now is a Jesuit priest, he's a Jesuit. Jesuits historically were the Marine Corps of the Catholic Church. They were the teachers. They were the guys that would go, the missionaries that would go to third world countries and beat up people and make them Catholics. Well, over time they evolved, and they kind of saw the error of their ways, and the Jesuits were the people that said, look, if we teach people about other religions, and they come back and become a Catholic, that makes them a stronger Catholic because now they're doing it of free choice. That was very opposing to the conservative Catholics within the establishment. So that kind of put the Jesuits on the outs with the Vatican at the time. So that's where we are right now. The Catholic Church internally has got a great schism. You got a progressive pope and the hardcore conservatives that want it to go back to the old ways. I just wanted to tell you guys that around the end of the 12th century was Pope Innocent III is the one that he banned Catholics from reading the Bible. I thought it would be misinterpreted. And it was only overturned after Vatican II in 1963 or something like that. So Catholics weren't even supposed to read the Bible until like 1963. My mom still remembers not being allowed to read the Bible. So
well, hell, church wasn't in English until Vatican II.
But guys, I think we being Masons like to look for deeper value, and I think it's really a simple thing. The Catholic Church was very little about religion in the early days. It was all about, like you said earlier, it was about land. They were kings. They were Holy Roman Emperor, you know. And it's only up until now that we're like, you know what, maybe a little bit of God is important. So I think that we're overanalyzing this. I think the Catholic Church saw Freemasonry that was teaching people free thought was an obvious threat to the Catholic Church that didn't want people to think. That's all I wanted to say, really. It's not as deep or nefarious as we want to think that it is. And I think the only thing Pope Francis has ever said about Catholicism is we still kind of keep him up at night. He has not made any other statements. He said he still feels uncomfortable talking about Masonry. And I've been told that it's mainly because of our oath and obligation that theoretically we're supposed to kill each other, you know, if somebody really, but that's, he has not, like you said, he has not said anything other. And I think a lot of that was out of respect to Pope Benedict. So I think that's the other reason he hasn't touched us with a 10-foot pole. Sorry. All right. Have a good night, guys.
Brother says, always good to see you, even in the dark. Mike Mosley brought up a good comment. This is just food for thought. Imagine the Catholic Church corporate structure admitting that Freemasonry is actually compatible after all. It'd be a very difficult and embarrassing message to explain to their members and would lose significant faith. I think there's some honesty to that. I think there's some truth there. And I think it'd be hard to find any Catholic to admit that, but I think that's an interesting concept or opinion for sure. All right, let's give the last word to Worship Brother John Bizak. Did you have any comments or questions to put Darrin on the spot?
I do, brother. Darrin, excellent exploration of this subject. Thank you for your time this evening for putting this together and your willingness to let this become part of the Rubicon Masonic series in our library. 2 questions. In your view, will Freemasonry ever be acceptable to the Catholic Church? And will it make a pivotal difference to the institution of Masonry now or in the future?
I'm going to say no and no. Yeah, I would love to see them come to Jesus moment. I hate to use that phrase there, but as Brian was saying, I just don't think it's going to happen. As was noted in the chat post, that would be a walking back. That would be hard to do for the church. I don't think they're going to do that. I think maybe they'll water down some rhetoric, but I mean, Davis, you get on this, or I would definitely not recommend doing this, but if you stumble across, which I have the unfortunate pleasure of doing, things like the faith militant, and I mean, these are serious, hardcore conservative Catholics. I mean, these are guys that would still rather be there being a Latin mass and all that, and they're perfectly entitled to that viewpoint. But those guys are not ever going to change, and wasting your breath trying to convince them, I think, is a waste of resources. So that's why I think even if these guys never sort of come around to us, I don't think that's going to affect us as an institution, because our beliefs aren't going to change. We're not going to all of a sudden say, oh yeah, that religious tolerance only applies to Catholics. We're not going to say that. So I don't think that would have much of an impact. I mean, there's still Catholic Freemasons around the world. Just as Dave was telling a story about someone receiving communion with a lapel pin. Same story came out of the Philippines like 3 weeks ago. At a big conference thing, and this guy was like freaked out, just like the gentleman that you had noted. So I don't think, I would like to hear your take, John. You know more about sort of dynamics, especially globally, on Freemasonry and how it interacts with other institutions. I'm saying no on both accounts.
I agree with you. Thank you very much, Darrin.
Thank you, Worship Brother Bizak. So, brothers, we live in a world that now more than ever, ignorance is rampant, especially with social media. It's hard to find the truth, and most people are too lazy to look for the truth. People love to hate. It's easier to hate than it is to love and be tolerant these days. And this is precisely why religion is not discussed in Freemasonry, because whatever your religion is, you know it, believe it, feel it from the bottom of your being, and it can bring people together and it can tear people apart, and it's a scary thing. The main thing that I always come back to with this topic is in the book of Matthew, it says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." It's easy to point the finger, but we need to be pointing the finger at us, and I think that's what Freemasonry does. It helps us point the finger back at ourselves. Personally. So those are just some final thoughts that I had. So Brother Darrin, fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for putting this together. I wouldn't be surprised if we have you back again. So thank you. All right, brothers, let's move on to a final few slides and then we'll call it an evening. All right, so next month, we have just discovered that our presenter will be, John, would you mind introducing that or mentioning that?
Sure. Sure. It'll be Kirk White. He's a past master of a lodge in Vermont. Kirk is also the author of Operative Freemasonry, a manual for restoring light and vitality to the lodge. That's one of the more popular books about our craft for the last, since it was published in 2012. So I would encourage you to make time to listen to Kirk's views about that topic.
Great. Thank you. And before I let you go, would you mind giving an update, an overview of the Philalethes Society for anybody that may not have heard that?
Sure. Brothers, the Philalethes Society, if you aren't aware, was founded in 1928. It's the International Masonic Research Society, and it's the oldest independent Masonic Research Society in North America. It started to serve the needs of those seeking a deeper insight into the history, the rituals and symbols of Masonry, as well as spreading Masonic light. It publishes the quarterly edition of the Journal of Masonic Research and Letters. And if you want to learn more about Philalethes, follow the link on your screen, or you can get a hold of me and I'll be glad to assist you in pursuing that interest. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. In case you guys weren't aware, we have transactions that we're working on publication, and Worship Brother Dan, would you mind giving an update on that, sir?
It's my understanding that our graphic design artist has reached out to us, and that the final draft of the transactions will be coming back to us for review soon. We expect to have those available before our Classic Masonic Authors Conference in August.
Okay, great. So see, the word soon is a very expandable word. We can do whatever we want with that word soon. So we're trying. Gentlemen, please be patient. We thank you. For anyone that hasn't already seen it, please check out the documentary that Rubicon did on the Masonic table. You can view it on Amazon Prime. We'd love to get your feedback on that. And as Worship Brother Kimball announced just briefly a moment ago, we do have an event coming up, and it has been finalized. And this is the first that we're making aware of it. There will be more formal invitations sent out to everyone. But if you are watching this and are interested, you can go to RubiconMasonicsociety.com/conference 2023-2023. So basically, This is our 11th year that Rubicon has conducted a festive board in Lexington, Kentucky at Spindletop Hall, a beautiful place. It's actually the same location that the documentary was filmed in. We're going to be having all of our normal toast, dining, fellowship, songs. Darrin, who presented tonight, will likely be in his kilt as the crier. Don't want to miss that. We're asking everyone who has an interest to RSVP by the 15th of August, if not sooner. When spaces are gone, they will be gone. I believe we're only able to have 85 or so at the festive board and a few more at the conference. So the way this works is you can choose to participate in one or both. The conference will be Friday, August. Oh, shoot. What is it? August 18th, right? Yes, August 18th. And the conference will be the following morning, beginning at 8 o'clock on Saturday, the 19th at the Hilton in Lexington downtown. So it's a 2-day event. You can either come to one or the other or both. If you want to attend just one of the events, either festive board or the conference, it will be $100 for each of those. If you want to come to both, then it will be $150. So we encourage you to come to both, join us, participate with us. There'll be some great education. And speaking of the education that we'll be discussing, Worship Brother Dan, would you talk briefly about the authors that we're going to be highlighting during this conference on the Saturday?
So we have called this conference the Classic Masonic Authors Conference. And if that's too much of a mouthful, feel free to refer to it as Classic Con, which we have been doing frequently. The authors whose works we will be discussing are men who wrote mostly in the 20th century and whose works influenced Masonic thought in the 20th century. And those men are Andrew Somerville McBride, a Scots Mason, and the author of an excellent book called Speculative Masonry. Worshipful Brother Andrew Hammer will be coming down from Washington, D.C. to present on the works of Brother McBride. You can draw a straight line from the works of Andrew McBride to the works of Joseph Fort Newton, who will be the second author whose works we will be exploring. And Brother Newton is the author of The Builders and several other excellent books on Freemasonry. His writing period was roughly from about 1915 to about 1930. And then after that, he continued to write, although not as frequently, about Masonic topics. And after Brother Newton, we're going to skip ahead to the 1950s and 60s and look at the work of Most Worshipful Dwight L. Smith, a past Grand Master and past Grand Secretary of the Grand Lodge of Indiana, whose works included Whither Are We Traveling and Why This Confusion in the Temple. And Brother Chris Hodapp will be coming in from Indiana to talk about the works of Dwight Smith. And then finally, certainly not least, we'll look at the works of Right Worshipful Tom Jackson, the past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, who wrote extensively in the closing years of the 20th century. And our own Worshipful Brother Bizak will be making a presentation about the works of Tom Jackson. So there are four men whose works greatly influenced Masonic thought in the 20th century, and we will be exploring their works on that Saturday, August the 19th. So I hope you make plans to come to Lexington and join us. As Worshipful Brother Brian mentioned, there is a festive board on the evening of Friday, August the 18th. We have a very special keynote speaker for that event. I'm going to ask Worshipful Brother Bizak if he will let you know some information about our keynote speaker that evening.
Sure, that would be Antonio Mantica, who is a recently raised Mason and an officer this year at Lexington Lodge No. 1. And we chose Antonio because he's not only a knowledgeable now and well-spoken brother, he's a PhD candidate at the University of Kentucky, and he is an actor. And he does deliver, and he does convince you of his beliefs. And we believe talking about the conference itself and the authors and what's in store the next day. And I would encourage you to make time to see him. He'll also appear, I believe, Brother Brian, in some of our trailers and announcements about the conference and the festive board, which we hope to go out next week or the first week in May.
Brother Brian, if I may, one last thought. when we study the works of Joseph Fort Newton, Newton wrote a book that really isn't about Masonry, but it's all about Masonry, and it's his autobiography called River of Years. And in River of Years, he recounted a very, very brief story that I think is ties in very well with what we have discussed this evening. And Newton wrote that all of religion can be summed up in 6 words. And those 6 words are: know thyself, control thyself, and give thyself. And then Newton goes on to say that if religion can be summed up in those 6 words, so can Freemasonry. And I think that's some of the brilliance of Newton's writing is contained in that simple passage. I think that's appropriate in light of what we have discussed tonight. And that's a foretaste of what we'll be talking about at Classic Con on August the 18th and 19th.
Great. Well said. Thanks for that addition. Just another point of understanding. So when we have the conference on Saturday, we do plan to have it recorded professionally for the purpose of sharing that knowledge and information to anyone that might not have been able to attend. How that production actually pans out in the end is still to be determined, but it's likely that that could be another Amazon production to continue to promote the education of Freemasonry. So we do plan to do that on a very high level professional skill, but it will not be at all scripted or rehearsed or revisited like it was during the Masonic table. For those of you that were there, that was a difficult production. This will be nothing like that. We'll just be recording the event live. So come join us. You don't want to miss it. This will likely be one of the best we've ever done. Brothers, as you know, the Rubicon Masonic Society is a nonprofit. So any monies that come into us, it just helps to cover our little expenses here and there to continue to provide what we need in the form of Masonic education. So if you have any interest in donating, you can go to RubiconMasonicSociety.com/donate. For those of you that have donated, no matter little or small, we appreciate your thoughts and assistance with that. With that being said, we will close it out here. Worship Brother Alan Martin, will you please do the honors of offering the closing devotion?
Brothers, if you will join me. As we part company, Grand Architect of the Universe, may we keep in mind that we are still together in spirit and in purpose. We work for your great purposes through Masonry, so grant us the necessary strength, wisdom, and courage to continue our efforts with enthusiasm and creativity. May your love be the guide in our thoughts and actions, now and throughout our lives. Amen.
So much it be.
Thank you, Brother Chaplain. Brothers, our next meeting is May 29th. It's usually on the 4th Monday of every month, unless otherwise notified. There are 5 Mondays in May, and our next meeting will be on May 29th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you know of any brothers that might like to participate with us, please ask them to go to RubiconMasonicSociety.com/RSVP. Anyone that is already on our mailing list, you do not need to RSVP. We will send you the information for that event the morning of. Until next time, brothers, may we always be happy to meet, sorry to part, and happy to meet again. Brother Gulla, thank you again. We appreciate your time this evening. Everyone have a great night. We'll talk to you soon.